Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Food Power webinar this afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. Um, today are going to be hearing from a number of speakers who recently went on a trip to the U.S. to attend a conference in North Carolina about food poverty and community engagement. So I'm just going to take us through a few basics about the webinar, and then we'll get straight to our speakers. So my name is Maddie. I work at Food Power, based at the charity Sustain in London. We're going to then, our speakers today include Penny Walters from Food Newcastle, Dee Woods from Independent Food Aid Network, Ben Pearson, also from Food Power, who is on the trip, and Kayleigh Garthwaite from the University of Birmingham, who's also a trustee of the Independent Food Aid Network. Um, just a few logistics about the webinar part of this. If you can hear me okay, can you say hello and where you're listening from in the attendee chat on the left-hand side? This is just a nice way to make sure that everyone can hear us and that we can see where people are coming in from. Emily is from Brighton. Hi, Emily. If anyone's having, Ben's and Preston, if anyone is having connectivity issues, we recommend trying to use Chrome if you aren't already. But sometimes it asks you to download an app if you're using other ones. So as you can see on the left-hand side, we've got the attendee list. You can see where people are listening in from, and we've got the attendee chat. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to just write them in into the chat as we're going along. The speakers will probably answer them further along when we do a Q&A at the end. This is a public chat, so everyone can see what you write as you're seeing. There's also a way to send the presenters a question at the top of your screen. So if you want to ask us something privately, then you're welcome to do that as well. But we also like to have the questions public so everyone can see them if you're comfortable with it. We also always highly encourage people to share their own contact details in the attendee chat. If someone's asking about, oh, are you working on this in this area? It's a great place to trade information as people kind of learn about what's happening in different parts of the country. The webinar is recorded, including all of the sound and the slides. And after the webinar is done, we'll put a link up to it on our webinar page, and then we'll email everyone so they've got a copy of that as well. So if you want to share what we've talked about today with anyone else, you know. So the one other thing I wanted to say is that a little bit about what Food Power is. I can see there's a lot of familiar people joining in, which is fantastic. But just for those of you who don't know us, we're a UK-wide program that's delivered in partnership by Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming, and Church Action on Poverty, and we're funded by the Big Lottery Fund. The aim of Food Power is really about strengthening communities' ability to reduce food poverty by tackling its root causes at the local level. And we do this by working with about 50 local partnerships, what we sometimes call alliances, that are based in different areas around the UK. Over the last 2.5 years we've been going, we've been creating a peer learning network to develop and share solutions among the alliances, like these webinars. And the program also offers financial support for activities. We host regional learning networks. We have a peer mentoring system. We have a lot of online resources. The team can offer advice and, of course, these webinars. So we encourage you to check out our website and to see how you could get involved and to get more involved in the work of our speakers today. So the way we've structured, excuse me, the way we've structured the webinar today is around 3 main questions. The first one is about what the speakers learned from the conference. The second one is about what they want to do differently from the conference. And the third one is what they're going to shout about now that they've been on this trip. I shouldn't say conference. As you'll hear, people did a bit more than just the conference. Then we're going to open it up to questions from you via the chat box. And that'll take us right up to 3:30. So I'm first going to hand over to Ben, who's just going to tell us a little bit about what they were all up to in the US.
Thanks, Maddie, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us. So yeah, just a little bit about how the trip came about. Nearly a year ago now, Kayleigh invited myself and some of the experts by experience involved in food power down to Birmingham to a conference around um, food poverty in the UK, US, and Canada. So, whilst attending that, we were able to meet various different people who we then saw again at the Closing the Hunger Gap conference. But we started conversations with an organisation called Why Hunger, who are one of the main organisers for the Hunger Gap, and they were really keen to have food power represented, and also some people with lived experience of food insecurity at the conference, both to run a workshop. Heather, who's in the picture on the screen, who is working today, so unfortunately can't be with us. She was on a panel alongside experts from the US and from Canada, which I'm sure Kayleigh will talk a little bit more about. And then following the conference, we were then invited to New York, where Why Hunger hosted us, and we were able to visit around 8 different organisations and projects in New York City. So the idea of the trip was for us to share what Food Power are doing, but also to explore. I think Why Hunger have very similar sort of approaches to um, things that they're doing across the US. So an opportunity for us to get together and learn from each other. So that's a general overview. I think we'll move on to the questions now.
Super. Thanks, Ben. So, each of the speakers has been given the challenge of trying to sum up their responses to these questions in 2 minutes. So, our first key learning is going to be coming from Ben. So, you're up. You're up.
Feels a little bit like a competition.
Like a game
Okay,
show.
2 minutes. It's difficult to sum things up in 2 minutes, but my main reflections coming back were that many of the challenges that we're facing are similar. Lots of the underlying issues in the US and Canada are also very similar. And when the picture in on screen now is of a number of us who got together for a global solidarity alliance and discussed some of these, and it was really evident that the solutions are also probably quite similar, and we need to work together in solidarity. So that's the main thing that came across clearly to me, that it's a lot of those underlying root causes that um, we're all facing, that is one of the main challenges. The other thing that came across quite clearly was language and terminology, which I know we talk a lot about in the UK as well, but it's vital really to understand some of the underlying issues in more detail, and thinking really carefully about the language that we use, that it isn't too academic, that it doesn't stigmatise or label people, that it's done alongside the knowledge and expertise of those with lived experience. And I think as well, something that was really evident for me was people talking quite openly about race and gender and things like that, which perhaps we don't do so much in the UK, but that again are quite often underlying issues to why people are experiencing food insecurity.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Now we're next on to Penny about what's the main thing that you take away as learning from it.
My main thing to learn was the food provision movement is more widely used and accessible and normalised in the US than it is in the UK. They have more contacts, more contracts, more suppliers, and but they also supply more people. Their food is still a basic the same as us that they give out, unless they're a larger organisation. But they also grow a lot more to help out with what people are getting.
And was there mostly around like food banks that you saw like were more widely accessible there? Like there's just like a more infrastructure kind of and more people using them?
Yes, a lot more people use them.
Yeah. Great. And then next up from Kayleigh.
Hello. Yeah, so I think mine follows on quite well from what Ben was saying actually. And as Ben mentioned earlier about the conference that I had in November last year, and after that conference we talked about sort of creating a sort of, it sounds quite grand, but like a global solidarity alliance to sort of, resist and sort of, resist against sort of the current model of sort of charitable food provision in the US and Canada, but also what we see in here in the UK, which is an increasing sort of permanence of it. So I did a workshop with Dee, who we're going to hear from obviously as well today, but also with Andy Fisher, who's from America. He's written a book called Big Hunger, and also Emily Mathiasen from an organisation called FIAN International. So we did a session sort of talking about this possibility of like organising a sort of alternative movement really to sort of the current narrative that we have around sort of charitable food provision as being an accepted sort of response to people who are in food insecurity and food poverty. And I think one of the sort of key things that came out for me was that actually after we did the session, a lot of people were really sort of really interested, really enthusiastic about that idea. But some people were sort of, wary of actually sort of putting the head sort of above what's the phrase that you would say? I don't know, sticking the neck out and actually saying, look, I want to resist this in my organisation. There was a sort of fear around that. But then some other people were like, actually, no, we shouldn't be afraid of that. We should be challenging things. We should be resisting. And we heard from some people who, like an example was, there was somebody who spoke at the end of our workshop and said that he ran a sort of food pantry in America, and he talked about how he'd sometimes rejected food that was really unhealthy, and he said it was difficult to do that. Obviously, people need food. He didn't want to be rejecting charitable food, but at the same time, he didn't want to be accepting food that he didn't feel people should be having to accept. So I think there was a lot of, like I say, a lot of enthusiasm for this idea of sort of going forward with this sort of idea of a solidarity alliance.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And Dee.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Race, ethnicity, and structural racism, and the intersection with gender for me was one of the stark things that stood out for me. Basically, we don't talk about this in the UK, whereas in the US, there was an entire strand at the conference around this. There were sessions on sort of racial equity tools and on social justice. And I think it is something that we seriously need to be looking at in the UK, not just in research, but in terms of our own practice within our frontline organizations. And I think because food justice emerged from sort of the racial and gender inequities in the US, particularly as it relates to land and farming, it is much stronger there. I think it's one of the reasons why we have that connection to growing and farming projects as a way to, reduce food aid. And I think it's something that we seriously need to be looking at here in the UK.
Super. Thanks. We're now going to go on. The next main question we had for the speakers is, as from going on these trips, what's one thing that you now want to do differently based on what you've learned and seen in the US? So Penny's up first.
What we did, it was like sort of, we want to engage more with people and do community gardening, community growing, which we've started out on the first steps of doing that.
Great. And that's up in Newcastle. You guys have started that a little bit with some of the projects in Food Newcastle?
Yes, I've got various meetings set up for the next couple of weeks to talk about the community garden and some community growing.
Nice. And at the conference, did you feel like was there more connection between food aid, food provision, food banks, kind of, and like were the connections that you were seeing there among food aid and gardening, or was it just the stronger links, almost like what Dee was talking about, like the food justice moving, including things like gardening and growing and access to land?
Not so much with the food aid, but more communities were encouraged to grow food.
Nice. And so was that up in like the projects in New York that you guys were seeing some of those?
That was both projects in New York and projects in North Carolina.
Huh. It's a really interesting point, I think, because I'd say that from like a lot of the food poverty events that we've had here, we haven't had as much representation from the growing and gardening side of things. So um, it's exciting to see how that could be linked up better in different ways. Um, Kayleigh, what's one thing that you think you're going to do differently now?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, this links into Ben's sort of key learning. We haven't planned this, honestly. It's just the way it's worked out. So we're obviously on the same wavelength. But obviously, I didn't actually go to New York like the rest of these guys on the call. I went to rally for the conference to North Carolina, but I didn't actually go on to New York. But I think definitely, like when Ben was saying about the language that we use, I think that definitely came up throughout the conference. I think about using terminology that actually everybody can understand, because it could be just terms that, say, like me as an academic, I don't know, terms that you might use quite often, but sometimes that can actually be exclusionary for people, especially when we're thinking about when trying to engage a lot more and involving people with sort of expertise who are experts by experience. So, and I think again it's something that on the Friday following the conference, we had like a 1-day meeting to discuss this, sort of bringing together like a solidarity alliance, and the sort of making sure that we use language that isn't stigmatizing or exclusionary really was something that came up. But I thought before I move on, I'll actually just explain what the photographs are showing. So basically, Heather Walters from Food Power Newcastle, along with others, we had Antonio, he was from Food Chain Toronto, Helen Kane, she was from Bloomington in Indiana, from Mother Hubbard's Cupboard, and then we had Jackie from New York. Jackie Bogart from New York, who was working with a food bank in upstate New York. So these four guys on the left of the picture, on the picture that is on the right, if that makes sense. They were our four panelists when we had like a plenary panel at the conference on lived experience. And this was the first time in the conference history that they'd actually done this, like had a panel dedicated to listening to people with experience of food poverty. So I moderated that along with Rebecca D'Souza there. So it was quite a setup. We had like these big white sofas at the front of a massive room. So it was, could have been quite an intimidating setup, but actually all the panelists were amazing. It was definitely an experience.
Yeah, that's great that it was that they're incorporating that, and now I'm starting to come up with questions myself about how um, work with people with lived experience of food poverty has or hasn't been incorporated into work in the U.S. as much or in different ways. Because I know it sounds like what Dee's saying, it's got a much different, like much stronger intersectional approach that we could maybe bring over here more. But then also, I wonder if there's things that maybe they're gleaning from some of our work here that's kind of moved along in this way as well. Not that either side is perfect or kind of nailed it, but it's interesting to see how that's something very new for them as well. So, Dee, what's one thing that you think you're going to do differently now?
Be the critical friend. And by that I mean, I'm going to look at things constructively, and weaknesses and problems and the emotionally charged issues, which includes race. So I had so starting with that panel, I had an issue with it because it literally obliterated and erased, the whole discussion around race in a room that was sort of majority filled with people of color in a part of the US with
Mm.
people of color. And, you know, I think maybe it was an oversight, I don't know, but, you know, an important part of the conversation was missed. And I think, especially here in the UK, we're guilty of doing that as well, but for very different reason. I think there's some fear or blinkeredness around looking at sort of race and, you know, colonialism and the impacts of that, and our sort of diaspora communities, on women as well. And yeah, we, we,
Yeah.
we we need to be moving into some uncomfortable spaces to really unpack all the issues if we are going to change anything. So everything from housing and the impact from 60s right through, yeah, which impacts on women and people of color and disabled people, right? To, you know, who has access to land, you know, be it in cities or in country, and who's able to start a growing project or a
Mhm.
farm.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think that being a critical friend is something that we could all probably use a lot more of. So I'm sure it'll be a welcome, a welcome conversation. I hope for you with many people. And I'm what was I just thinking of? I think you're right about the access to land is a really interesting one because I think, yeah, like the US and the UK have such different histories that
Yeah,
they're drawing on, and how um, discussions around intersectionality have evolved in really different ways in the two countries. And so seeing like what we can um, bring from there, and like you're saying, bringing in race and gender and disability and all different aspects of things that affect things like poverty and food poverty, and then and figuring out how to make that the strongest it can be in the UK context.
yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah. Um, the we're on to Ben's gonna Ben. What's 1 to 4 things you're gonna do differently?
I'll try and get through these quickly. So,
Don't worry, don't.
um,
You're okay. You're
we,
okay.
we need to keep talking about root causes, and I think as we do with food power, but learning more from some of the people in the US, it's looking at not individualizing the issues. And I think this links into kind of what Kayleigh spoke about as well, about the language that we use, that even things, the term hunger can make out that it's an individual problem, whereas we need to talk about poverty and the underlying issues more broadly, and not even just food poverty, poverty in general. If somebody's experiencing food poverty, they're most likely experiencing other kinds of poverty. So I think it's looking at it more holistically at the root causes and thinking really carefully about the language that we use to do that. Something that really stood out for me as well was, which I haven't really um, seen much in the UK, certainly in more of the northern regions where I do more work, but kind of real food that was accessible and affordable, or at least affordable to a greater number of people than it might be here. When we visited some farmers markets in New York and East New York, where the farmers markets there were far less gentrified than ours, and just walking around the farmers markets, the diversity of the people there, and people could use the various different food tokens and incentives and things to get fresh food. And also, interestingly, the farmers markets, they had to be the farmers who were selling the produce. It couldn't be so. Whereas a lot of the farmers markets, I think, in the UK now have become gentrified or hip. There, they were real places where people went to buy food, and there seemed to be much more connection with individuals buying the food um, that was kind of linked to the heritage and things like that. And people, the East New York City Farms was groups of young people who were actually employed for a number of months over the summer to do the growing, and then they sold it in the local community to families and local people. Moving on from that, I think there was a lot of talk, and this is more reflection after coming back, really, but a lot of talk about choice and things. But I do think we have to be careful that not always presuming just because something's healthy and fresh, it's the best option or the choice that somebody wants. Because actually, yeah, okay, from a health perspective, not giving out certain foods in a food bank and having lots of fresh produce available might look good, but actually, if they're not accepting certain types of food that people might actually want, you are in effect removing some choice. You might be doing it for health reasons, but I think we just have to be really careful about how we use that word. And then a last one linking into language and terminology again, but had like quite an interesting discussion with the guy at East New York City Farms and looking at the language that we use. And often in this sector, we use words like vulnerable, at risk, disadvantage, but that isn't always really helpful, and it almost makes out that that actually they do have assets and they have lots of things that they can contribute. And I think it's thinking about how somebody wants to label themselves rather than somebody saying somebody's at risk. Actually, it can kind of stigmatize and label them even more.
Yeah, it's a really interesting last point. Is the person that you were speaking to in New York, did they have examples of how they were shifting the language that they used, or other things that were preferred with
It was kind of a
really?
question. This was this youth project, and I'd asked a question about whether they worked with. So I was at fault of using the language myself. I asked a question, something similar to, did they work with people who have offended or at risk of offending behaviour within that community? Because there was quite a high kind of crime and stuff. And the guy was like, he doesn't like to, this is the person, the farm manager doesn't like to use any of those terms because it almost, he used the example, it almost implies if you're saying that kid's vulnerable or at risk, that they're suddenly going to run into a shop and rob loads of food. And actually it can make somebody behave in a certain way rather than like empowering them to not be vulnerable or at risk.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Um, sorry, and then the last thing we wanted to hear from the speakers about is what's something that you're going to shout about? A lot of people mentioned the food they ate in North Carolina when I asked this question before the webinar, but so feel free to talk about the cuisine. But starting with you, Kayleigh, what do you want to shout about now?
Yeah, well, I didn't want to talk about chicken and waffles and honey. It's one of those things that you go for a food poverty conference, so it just feels really wrong to talk about that. Although that was an amazing part of the food over there, but no, I instead, and I think again this comes out of what everybody was saying, and especially Dee, what you were saying about that especially in the UK, how we don't talk about issues of like racism, gender, like, and for me, food sovereignty. Like, I admit I don't know enough about that, and I do want to know more about it. And as well, climate change, like that there was a lot of discussion of that and how that linked into sort of food systems and beyond at the conference in Raleigh. But that's not something that in the UK context that I'm aware of that really gets spoken about. So sort of it helped me to think a bit more about, like, going forward, actually how you can try and have a bit of an eye on the bigger picture, really. And I think, Dee, when you were saying about like the panel and stuff, I mean, that was something that me and Rebecca D'Souza, who were moderating it, we talked about that before. We're like, look, the issue of race just is not being represented really on the panel, and it came, like, we had some like discussions with the participants, a few like Skype discussions, sorry, before the panel. And again, because mainly the people on the panel were mainly sort of, they mainly were white people, it just didn't really come through as something that ended up something that we actually talked about, even though, like you say, it didn't really reflect then what was going on in the audience in some of the other sessions. So I think there is a lot of learning there, and I do think it's something going forward that definitely in my own work I know that I need to get more sort of awareness of. So it was really a learning curve, I think, the conference. And I just wanted to, I put this picture on here as well, and I'll just finish off talking about that. But this was literally, like, it was my first trip to America, and obviously went to Raleigh in North Carolina, and this place here was called Lake Johnson. It was literally like 10 minutes outside of the city. It was absolutely beautiful. So I just wanted to end with that nice sort of positive picture there.
That's very nice. Speaking of other beautiful pictures, I think those are tomatoes. Dee, what's one thing you'd like to shout about now?
Yeah, I think with the latest sort of research coming out from the GLA, and I'm sure that's going to be picked up with other cities as well, and it is mainly a sort of urban issue, is that the majority of people being affected by food insecurity are women and women of color in a white majority sort of country. So for me, that raises a serious issue and one we need to be looking at right now if we need to have sort of proper policy and on the ground responses. But just to pick up on some things that Ben and Kayleigh have said. So I have personal connections both in Raleigh and in New York. And I spent like an extended time there. And the first place I visited was a project called the Peace Garden. And it was basically all different cultures within sort of that part of Raleigh, sort of growing their own traditional food crops. And I know we have in some community gardens here, that we do that, but it needs to go beyond community gardening. Needs to become food production if we need to make it food resilient and to literally provide a dignified way of people being able to access food. It isn't just about affordability. One's culturally appropriate food needs to be available in the first place. The other places that we visited, there was one project we visited in Brownsville, which is like a really poor part of or underserved, talking about narrative, an underserved community in Brooklyn. And, they had a course where they were teaching people the skills to participate in sort of political spheres. So that's something we need to be doing as well. I know Food Power does a certain amount, but we need to be equipping people with skills and knowledge to self advocate.
Yeah, yeah. I I think your point around the GLA research, I just put it in the attendee chat for people back at the beginning of what you were saying about it. And I think the other one that really jumped out for me was the percentage of people with a disability who are experiencing food insecurity is 39. It was high 30%, I believe, but it was one of the other headline statistics that was coming out of this that you're saying, that you're right. It's disproportionate groups of people are or no, certain groups of people are disproportionately affected by food poverty, and that should be a much stronger that should have a much stronger influencer on forming the conversations we're having. I think is a really good point, and as I think that GLA research, like you said, is a really points to that very strongly. And I'm wondering now if we should. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm wondering about, are there food growing projects in the UK, and I'm sure there are, that are more strongly linked around, like you're saying, not just affordability, but accessibility and culturally appropriate food, and kind of trying to try to bring some of those projects, highlight them more so we can see what's already being done and working off of that. I think it's a really good point, Dee.
Um,
You're gonna,
I could say just very quickly. So
yeah.
Granville Kitchen, which I run,
Mm,
we started as a community garden, and part of what we're doing now is looking to upscale so that it does become food production,
mm,
but also to provide a market space or shop front where people can access food within the community rather than having to trek halfway across London. And yeah, there's Wolves Lane
Yeah.
as well in North London. So a lot more projects are thinking about it and
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think about how we can better bring those to the forefront. I think is a really good potential next step. I'm going to go on to Ben.
Thank you. So on the first day of the day before the conference started, I went on a kind of workshop around using stories and narrative to kind of bring about change. So I think the quote that's on the screen I quite liked, and I think also heard about some creative projects in New York, both from some of the growing projects we went to, but also things with art and music through Why Hunger, and just thinking how we can be more creative to bring about change. And then just what stood out for me really is how we continue to empower people at the grassroots with lived experience, but also I think it's really important that there's allies and activists who stand alongside them, so people it's not done in a tokenistic way or they don't feel alienated. I still sometimes, even though it's my job, but feel uncomfortable calling people experts by experience or having specific events and things that are kind of targeted and marketed as them. So I think it's thinking about how these individuals, a bit like similar to what Dee said, how they become more embedded. And some of the things that we heard about in New York as well were sounded much more sort of radical around the activism side of things, where people had like gone sit in some councillor's office for like a full day until they came down and spoke to me. And I think it's just taking some of that energy and trying to look at how we can use that to bring about change in the UK.
Thanks, Ben. And Penny.
Right, so it may be normal now to use emergency food aid provisions, but it shouldn't be. We should be getting the politicians to stand up and be accountable for and take the action to fix the issues with the social system before it comes as bad as it is in the US.
Yeah, I feel like that is a very strong note. That's why I put it in bold here. I just thought, yeah, I think you really nailed it there. Is that um, it's become much more institutionalized there in ways that it hasn't yet in the UK. And as you're saying, um, we need politicians to fix stuff now so that it doesn't become like that. Um, was there anything that jumped out in particular, Penny, that kind of um, like illustrated this? That was like a particular example that you found that kind of felt quite shocking.
The one food pantry that we visited in New York has been going for 40 years.
That is a very yeah, that's a good example. Oh my gosh.
And
Yeah.
was like into something that you've never seen before. The amount of it was almost like all I could relate it to was like A&E on a busy Friday night. That's what it
Really?
It
felt
was
like.
really
Yeah.
busy.
Yep. That is that's a stark example, I guess. I'm sure there's many busy UK food ones, but I don't think anyone's been doing it for 40 years yet. Um, um, One of the examples I remember hearing is about how the board of some of the food banks, I think it was the Boston Food Bank, the really big one in Boston, it's a network of them, had people on their board of trustees who were from the big supermarkets who would then get the donations. And it was kind of all very intertwined with the big supermarkets more, which is always something to me that felt like quite a cautionary tale. But 40 years, that's a good number to keep in your mind. We're gonna open it up for questions now and discussion kind of amongst the panelists or the speakers based on the questions. Simon's already written one in, but for anyone else who's got questions, now's your chance to put them into the attendee chat. So we'll start with Simon's. So he says, was there anything specific from your trip that you think UK funders should be aware of, or any examples of funders in the USA showing leadership on any of the issues you've mentioned, such as race or disability, or helping people develop the projects you mentioned? Anyone want to jump in on that one? Something you think funders should be aware of, or examples of good funding mechanisms over there?
Right, I think here the funders focus on migrants and refugees and ignore sort of, embedded sort of diaspora community. So it is hard to get funding. Where in the US, because there's a social justice sort of, core understanding of social justice and race and gender and that intersectionality, funders tend to fund projects that focus on that and sort of redressing that. And we don't have that here. Yeah, those sort of funders are few and far between.
Kind of links in.
Oh, go ahead, Ben. Sorry.
I was just going to say it kind of links into what Dee was saying, but the not that funding was discussed a lot, but the couple of times it was, and with like Why Hunger, there seemed to be more of an income stream that allowed for projects to have more sustainability. Whereas I think in the UK, it's people. I'm sure it happens in the US as well, but it's people chasing money a lot and short-term pilot projects that can't necessarily always be sustained.
So it sounds like one of the things there is almost trying to get funders. I was going to say to like understand language about social justice, but it's not about understanding the language. It's about understanding the issues and the aims of the projects. But it sounds like there's something there about trying to, and what you guys have all been saying too is trying to embed more of a social justice approach into the projects here, and then also, but also trying to, I want to say, bring the funders on the journey kind of as well, so that they're funding the stuff that is more empowering and stronger in those sense. That's a tough question, Simon. The next question we had coming in was about terminology. Emily was wondering what terminology was recommended by conference attendees to avoid stigma / what terms should be avoided. Does anyone want to share any thoughts on that?
I would say.
Okay.
No, go on, Kayleigh. It's fine.
Kayleigh, you go ahead first.
No, I was just going to say, I think what I saw was that actually it was sort of, it varied so much by like sort of person to person, because some people, like Ben mentioned before about the term hunger, but then obviously why hunger are called why hunger, and they spoke about actually about why it might be important to use the term hunger, but then for other people I think and for me I've sort of thought about it before of saying like if you're thinking about hunger, then maybe the logistical response is then to provide food, but obviously we know it's bigger than that, so there is that risk there if you just talk about hunger. But I think overall in terms of avoiding stigma, it did come down to that, what Ben was speaking about earlier as well, about not individualizing the problem. So making sure that instead of just talking about sort of food bank use or food pantry use or things like that, it is about sort of looking at the bigger picture, at the structural issues that are going on, and realizing that if people are experiencing food poverty, food insecurity, hunger, whatever we call it, it goes beyond beyond that individual level. Ben, do you want to add to that?
I think you pretty much kind of said what I'd have said. The only other thing I'd perhaps add is that even looking in the UK and the way in which we talk about experts by experience and different things, it can differ. Heather and Penny quite like the term. There's other individuals who aren't particularly a big fan of that, and the language and terminology people use can almost sometimes differ town to town or region to region. So I think it isn't just having one blanket approach, but just really being quite thoughtful. And I think that links into the whole thing around race and gender and things like that as well. But I don't know if there's clearly, yeah, like you said, Kayleigh, it's not that we should necessarily stop using the word hunger, but I think it's just being really thoughtful about how some words can be triggering in some ways and how we try to avoid them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably it's not an easy answer, but there probably isn't an answer. It is probably very case dependent, person dependent, context dependent. And I'm pretty sure my understanding is that food poverty isn't really a term in the U.S. that's used very much. I think they use food security a lot more. But yeah, context specific, I suppose. But it's yeah, and there's probably not an answer that will ever be right forever either. It'll probably keep changing as we go along. But
I
um,
think it's about some of the experts that I work with as well. There's people who got involved in the program and didn't realize that they were living in poverty, but then there were other people who got involved who knew that they were hungry. So I guess it's kind of just what words they use individually to describe their experiences they're going through. If somebody's been born into poverty, they might not understand what they're experiencing is food poverty. It might just be kind of their everyday, but then hunger might make them realize, oh, actually, this is an issue. So I think it's thinking carefully about what people associate with as well.
mm-hmm. um, excuse me. We had another question here from Jonathan, who says, and Jonathan, I might ask you to jump in here and explain part of it to see if I'm not totally sure. Maybe you've said, Jonathan said, on affordability and access in the example of Green NYC incentive schemes, was there much of a discourse around this at the conference? Recently, there was announced $260 million from federal government to expand this work. I'm assuming that's like in the U.S. The U.S. announced $260 million to expand it. Is this cutting across the food aid agenda? Does anyone want to? So I think he's kind of asking: is was there was the kind of growing examples around affordability and access, was that present in the conference as well? Is that kind of what you were asking, Jonathan? Or does anyone have thoughts on that question from Jonathan? Yes, that's what he says. Okay.
There wasn't particularly anything. I mean, Dean probably knows more about this. There wasn't anything specific at conference that none of the workshops I attended. Yeah, Dee, I think you're probably better.
Yeah, no, there wasn't anything at the conference, and I think especially in terms of local solutions, people were trying to get people off sort of food stamps and into work. So we visited sort of the Green Market, which is a project of Green NYC, and they were showing us, how they were sort of removing stigma and making it more accessible for people to use. But it is a central government funded, sort of program and has really nothing to do with the city or food aid projects.
Huh. So the market project was linked to getting people into work or food aid, or neither?
No, the market project is about enabling people to access fresh food
Okay,
using their state issued food stamps.
got it. But
Yeah.
it wasn't. It didn't feel as linked up to. But then you didn't see projects like that showcased at the conference as much.
Um, what we had showcased at the conference were projects like sort of Rise and Root Farm with Karen Washington, who basically grow food to sell at market that is accessible to anyone without having to use food stamps.
Okay. Okay. Huh. The yeah. Okay. Try not to just ask my own questions here, so I'm going to go back to the attendee chat. So Jennifer was wondering, was there any discussion around what makes for effective collaboration or partnership working? And I don't know if Jennifer's asking about like specific types of questions, but does anyone have thoughts on that? Was there much talk about kind of what worked well for working in partnership? No, maybe not. Okay, maybe it didn't come up at the conference. It sounds like.
Particularly, I think the Friday that me and Kayleigh and about 15 other people spent on the global solidarity stuff felt like the start of an effective collaboration. And I think that's because we recognised across the US, UK, and Canada, we're facing many of the same issues and can learn a lot from each other. In terms of hearing about collaborations and partnerships that are already formed and flourishing, not so much. It was mainly people talking about their own individual piece of work, which doesn't necessarily mean they're not working in collaboration, but it was more specific to particular projects.
Yeah. One of the questions I had, because there was some folks there from Canada, and I'm wondering because I know Canada, I'm pretty sure, has the right to food as a part in law in the country. I know here that's something that's been growing calls for the right to food to be embedded into UK law as well. Did any of the Canadians mention that, or about its effectiveness or non-effectiveness, or kind of did it come up in their work at all as being something that they like tapped into as a policy lever? Or maybe there weren't enough Canadians there. No. Okay.
No,
Sounds like no one's responding to that. That sounds like maybe not.
No, no, it didn't come up. No.
Okay. Okay. I was just curious among that kind of international chat if it had come up. We've just got a few more minutes left. I was wondering, was there any project you guys visited or met, or any, if any of you want to jump in, was there any like one project that you heard about or you met someone from that you really fell in love with? That was the other thing. Is there anything that you're just like, oh man, I met someone from this great thing and they were doing this? Was there any of those kind of interactions?
Yeah.
Like
So
to end on a positive, you know?
yeah, one of the projects I visited was called Elijah's Promise, which is in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And there's a woman there called Chef Pearl. And when the project started, they were just a soup kitchen and, churning out not so healthy food. And the project has transformed and it's become this educational project that provides training and jobs, and they have a growing aspect to it. So it literally shows you what can be done.
Mm,
If you sort of change your mindset and change the focus of your project. So rather than it being food aid, it's equipping people,
yeah.
to lift themselves out of poverty. So everything from incubating sort of um, food food businesses, and I visited, one of the coffee shops, which had sort of baked goods from the sort of main project where they have trainees making baked goods. A lot of their trainees are employed by the actual Elijah's Promise project, and yeah, they do catering, food production, and yeah, just turning people's lives around.
Mm.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it sounds like an amazing project, not only for what it does, but also how it's evolved, like going from something maybe more straightforward, like a soup kitchen, to then being a hub of so much more. And it kind of shows that you can, that projects can expand and evolve in different ways and kind of help tackle more than just the poverty or the food poverty angle of an issues in a community.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Penny, what about you? Was there anything that you saw that was really inspiring or kind of like a favorite project you visited or someone you met?
I actually loved going to the food pantry in New York. Not for the fact that it's been there 40 years, it's the amount of fresh food that they
Mm.
actually give out rather than tinned food. But, you know, Chef Greg was just absolutely amazing. Loved the man to bits.
They had a chef at the food bank.
He was the founder. Well, he wasn't the founder. Sorry, he's the guy who manages it now. But he is a chef. Yeah.
Ah. Well, so what was that? What was it like to what? How did it differ? Would you say, like Penny? How would it differ from the UK food banks? Other than,
Um,
yeah,
it's community.
sorry.
They treat the people that volunteer there as their community,
Mm.
but they also have like not what we would class as social workers, but there are people there to help them. So there are people there to make sure they get the right benefits, that they're getting all the money that they should be getting. You know, if they want to get back into work, there are people in that project there every day to help them get back into work. And it's like a one-stop shop. There are people there all the time that, you know, are there to help people. Where, you know, food banks we've gotten here in this country, you go, you pick your food up, you go home. You don't see anybody else.
But I think my feelings on it are quite different. I think a great project, and but for me, that there's people who've been going there for years, and it did feel like more people had trolleys, and it was like they were shopping, and that for me really stood out. Like this is embedded. Like going to do your shopping at a place like this isn't something. Yeah, they were doing innovative things and they had cookery demonstrations and all sorts of things, but it almost felt a little bit too much like a supermarket that. And again, that comes down to like language and terminology about actually some people might say, "Oh, we're going shopping now," and it feels more dignified and normal to them. But then, as soon as we start normalising something that is still emergency food provision, and again, all the fresh food there was amazing, and they had meat and dairy and everything like that. But certain people might also want other foods. The place that stood out for me was firstly Why Hunger, because they were just amazing hosts and think have very similar approaches to both Sustain and Church Action on Poverty in our programme. So I could feel there was lots of things that sort of overlapped, and they're kind of very much kind of from the roots and looking a bottom up sort of approach. And they kind of work with artists and musicians sounded really exciting. And the other one, the East New York City Farm, which I just felt was like a really vibrant place, and young people were involved in something really positive.
Thanks. Yeah. It sounds like Penny and Ben, what you guys are saying though, is almost one of the big tensions that I think a lot of people in the UK have been grappling with as well, though, around the evolution of food banks. And like Penny has been saying, like was saying previously about not letting, I mean, because not letting emergency food aid become shopping, right? Like the food bank you're describing doesn't sound like it probably is playing an emergency role so much as a long-term role in people's lives, which is good because people are getting food. But then, and like Penny is saying, that's like a community hub and it's dignified and there's people there to support you and it's not just about handouts. Just sounds like a really strong um, approach in so many ways. But on the other hand, like you're saying, Ben, on that flip side, it's kind of like, oh, but what we're trying to do is create social support systems so that people hopefully don't end up in these situations, or many fewer people do. Um, we've
And I
got.
think you have to be.
I'm gonna go over to Kayleigh now because she's got to say her favorite thing, and then I think we've got to wrap up. Sorry, Ben.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, well, I wasn't gonna actually. Well, what I was gonna say was that because it actually followed on from Ben's point about how the sort of permanence and normalization of places. Because like even though I didn't get to go to New York and go on a lot of the field trips, I did get to see some of North Carolina. So me and my friends who came with me on the trip, we went to the baseball one day, and I was really sort of shocked at just how much advertising there was inside the baseball arena for food banks. So there was like I took a photo of this. I was actually going to put it on my slides. I should have done really, but it was a photo of this picture, and it was saying however many home runs that the Durham Bulls hit, then Five Guys, you know, the burger company, they would give so much money to the food bank. And I thought it was really interesting because I saw that there, and then in quite a lot of the restaurants that I visited in Raleigh, they had sort of similar things like they would have leaflets about, you know, if you bought this, then they would give so much to sort of to children's school meals or different things like that. So it just seemed that sort of emergency food provision was really was embedded, and I think having that sort of corporate involvement as well, I think, is a cautionary tale for us in the UK. So I think that was a sort of really interesting point for me that I took away from it.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much to our speakers. I think that's a good note to end on. It's just like almost it's interesting the use of the word emergency and how much the urgency of the issues here in the UK, and that seems like one of the biggest contrasts you guys are talking about between the UK and the US, and about how by maintaining a sense of urgency around these issues, hopefully we can try to limit the move towards further institutionalization, while also only, and of course also simultaneously trying to put into place systems that better support people. So as Ben just mentioned in the comments, Penny and Heather and Ben are all going to be writing some blogs to put up soon about more about their trips, and I'm sure that they'd be happy to talk with people more if they wanted to hear about any of the details of it. Thank you very much, Kayleigh and Dee and Penny and Ben, for joining us today. Thanks everyone else for joining. Our next webinar, I'm just going to email, I'm putting it up on the website today, is going to be on the 29th of October, all about Healthy Start. So we hope you can join us for that again. And thanks for coming along.
Thanks, Maddie.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.